And I don't, okay. So we just got recorded. So I'll say what I just said again and start over a second. So this module it's not just about the research plan. It's to really focus on the parts of the application that are not the specific aims and are not the actual grant body. And the reason that I really want to emphasize this is I've been doing grant review for 15 years, and I've seen that a lot of investigators pay inadequate attention to this part of the research plan, and that it can really hurt them in the grant review game. So the who's with us today is Mark Patrick, and I actually forgot what your job title is, but he works in the actual grant business office. So.
Hi, my name is Mark. I'm in the sponsor projects office here at Nemours. So we handle everything from beginning to end. As at different places, University of Delaware has a business administrators that also then work with post-award. We handle pretty much everything through here, except final accounting parts. Also here with us today is Shakita Wilder, that's in our office, and Kim Boja, and they both also help with the clinical trials and non-federal grants and federal grants as well.
So essentially, we want to try to give you a timeline and also really talk about some of the most common sections for NIH grants, talk about some things you really have to be careful about, as well as now there are also other sections, especially for those who are going to K awards, which I'm not going to directly address today, but a lot of the general principles are exactly the same for any sort of grant that you're going with. So the first thing that I really want to emphasize is that you have to figure out and really get to know your research administrators. Basically, the most common sign that you will see in a grant administrator's office is your failure to plan does not make it my emergency. Simply because investigators have a very strong tendency to not tell their research administrators far enough in advance that they are going in for a grant so that your grant does not enter their workflow. Keep in mind that all NIH grants pretty much have the same deadlines, so you need to be on your grant administrator's radar screen early. You also need to find out what information that they need to know and when do they need to know it in order for your grant to be processed through the system promptly. That there are tons and tons of stories of investigators whose grants never get submitted because they don't inform their research administrators in sufficient time. And the thing you have to really understand is that grants are not submitted by the investigator. They are submitted by the institution. And if the institution doesn't feel that things are in place, that they can support your application, it will not be submitted. So I'll let Mark see if he has something to say about that.
It's definitely, the more time that you can get, the better for us. We've here at Nemours have instituted a way called the intent to pursue system, which is when you know you have a proposal, get it in there. I know University of Delaware has a certain system as well, and there's pretty much every place has some kind of system in place to say, just as Melinda said, that it's on your radar to look for. And it helps us because then we can kind of share the wealth of work and who's going on and who can handle this project and who can handle this one. With our office, it's 4 people. So it's we try and go through that process of how we're going to do it. So.
And also it's important if you're applying for non-federal grants that are off of deadlines, it's important to let people know because at least a lot of grants administrators, they choose their vacations away from the NIH grant deadlines. So if you tell somebody a week before it's due that, oh, I'm going to submit this, it's possible that your direct grants administrators are going to be on vacation. And they didn't know to have things done ahead of time. Like just recently, my lab submitted a grant that was on a odd time, but we told her, our grants administrator 8 weeks out, and we just made sure that we had all of the paperwork done from the institution before she left for vacation. So because the grant deadline was right in the middle of the time that she was out, because it was off of a standard federal deadline. So that please interrupt us as we go. That I'm trying to do this completely through video conference today. And so I'm not getting like face feedback of knowing what is getting through, what's confusing and stuff. So please jump in at any time. Okay?
Okay.
Okay. All right.
Good.
All right. So the second thing is that you really, once you have informed your grants administrators, which will definitely help you, you need to really find out what non-research plan information you need to submit. You need to familiarize yourself with those directions, and you need to work on those sections early. And it's something I can't emphasize enough. Folks get so wrapped up about the research plan that they think, oh, the environmental page is no big deal. I can do that the day before. I can pretty much guarantee you would rather work on editing your research plan the day before, not spend the time on the environment pages or on the Biosketch or so forth. Particularly if you're sending in out your research plan for people for feedback, often that feedback will come in very, very late in the game. And you don't want to be having to decide between writing your environment page and incorporating feedback that's come from folks you've given your grant to read. So we all get burnt out when we write our research plans. Use the writing of the Biosketch, the writing of the environment pages and so forth as a way to take a break from really having to think hard about your science. And also, if you know all that stuff is to bed, all that stuff is already uploaded into the grants computer, it reduces everyone's stress level. It'll reduce your stress level. It will allow you to keep refining your research plan up until the time you can submit. And it will mean that your grants office loves you.
I completely agree. It's one of those things that the budget's one of the easiest things to take care of. And that's what I always try to tell our folks. I know it's 2 weeks away from your proposal, but if you have your Biosketch done, if you have your environmental done, go through that process and you can start filling in. We can have that all set for you. So when the day of submission, all you have to do is add those last pieces and we're good to go with this.
So I think Erin is about to put up the piece of paper that we're kind of working. Okay, cool. Thank you. Okay, cool. So now, this session is going to be completely associated with the grants pages. There is a link on the handout here that is from NIAID and National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases. They have, for at least the time I've been doing this, past 20 years, they have had excellent resources for grant writing on their website, better than any other NIH institute. And some of the things that are quite remarkable is that they actually have up there fully grants that have been submitted that fit the examples that they decide are exactly what you want. And you can actually look at full funded grants that were funded through NIAID. So if you go there, you'll be able to download complete applications, and you can get a real idea of how people have effectively done all of the environment page sections. And I would really encourage you to go to that site. So any questions kind of in the standpoint of the general theme that we're going through here? Are we good?
Not right now.
Good.
Okay. All right. So the parts about common sections of NIH grants. The first that I want to talk about is the environment. And it's environment / resources, and there's two separate sections here. That basically a lot of folks make the big mistake of relying too much on boilerplates that are coming from other investigators at their institution, because it's somewhat of a pain. You have to find out all this information. The problem is that the boilerplate information is often insufficiently detailed. And it's also, and so people put the boilerplate in, they have checked the environment box. But what they haven't done is done what the intent of the environment resources page are. And that is to really convince the investigator that or not the investigator, but the grant reviewers, that the environment is a really good place to actually do what work you are proposing. And it really helps a lot to try to relate your environment to the proposed work. And you really want to sell that it can be done in the environment in the highest level. Now, something that might not be completely PC to say, but it's true, the CTR partner institutions were not necessarily the best known research institutions in the United States. And that you have to understand that environment is one of the criterion scores for an NIH grant, which means is that you're putting your grant in and you're competing for that criterion score against institutions that are way better known, whether that's Harvard Medical School or University of San Diego or Washington University St. Louis or whatever extremely well-known institution there is. Folks from those institutions can get away with poorly written or non-detailed environment pages. However, the CTR partner institutions, all four of us, are at institutions where there might be no one on the grant review committee who's familiar with our institution. So we are responsible for convincing that grant reviewer that we have the perfect environment to get our work done. This is something I'm very sensitive to personally because all of my research is funded from the National Eye Institute. And I've been at the University of Delaware for 17 years. And 15 of that, I had the only NIH grant from that institute in the entire state of Delaware, okay? The only reason people in my field know about the environment at the University of Delaware is because of my reputation in my field. So I have to be responsible for telling the reviewer that I have everything in place to do what I need to do. This is true. So in my case, I'm a basic scientist. I don't do a lot of clinical research. So I have to show I have all of the equipment, supplies, that I have a graduate program behind me. I have all of those sorts of things. I know that when we did this CTR training last year, one of the investigators who was funded through Nemours, they actually had a hard time. They had a hard time with the grant reviewer basically not believing that this clinical project could be done at Nemours. I believe something on some kind of an orthopedic problem. Now, Nemours has an incredibly high orthopedic patient load. However, it wasn't outlined in the application. The reviewer was unfamiliar with Nemours' pediatric orthopedic patient load. And they did not get a good environment score because the reviewer did not believe that Nemours had the infrastructure and the patient population necessary to do the work. So it's just something you have to be self-aware enough to really understand that it's your responsibility to sell this. And you can't assume people will say, oh, yeah, I'm at Nemours or I'm at Christiana Care. And I know that Christiana Care has the third highest number of deliveries of newborns in the country. It might not be common knowledge among, let's say, the newborn research community, but it's a huge resource, so you have to tell them. So that basically the take home is that you don't just rely on canned boilerplates for this. And actually the directions in the NIH grants say, explain your environment and explain how does your environment actually facilitate success on your research project. The prompt gives you the opportunity to say, I have this available so I can be very successful in AIM 2.1 of my application. Very few applicants do that and take advantage of that opportunity, but it says in the NIH guidelines you can and are encouraged to do that. So that one of the things that I think I submitted that is available online is some guidelines about environment pages and some templates, and you can absolutely look at office as well. So I don't know if Mark has anything.
No, just with actually Lee just did her K award this recently, and one of the things you did was you went and asked how many grants we were putting in and all that process.
Because we have grown so much.
Exactly.
Actually,
So
over even just a few years.
and so the data was so different from that period that she did take the new numbers from there. So yeah, I definitely say go with that. We, as our office, we provide basically what we have to you as just a guideline, and then from there you can take that information and say, well, what can we update this? Can we update these numbers? So it helps you in that process. So.
And I definitely leveraged the Delaware CTR too in my environment section, which I think helps because I think they still think we're young, as you just said, in terms of being a research institution, just showing that we have this new research and the work of institutions. But I did get that same critique in my K. Are you going to be able to accomplish this with this new kind of less research-oriented environment?
So, and the thing is that sometimes your environment is perfectly beautiful. It's just that since it doesn't have a reputation, you can't rely on that. There's this tendency among NIH study section members to just, give all environments 1 or 2. But where they're less inclined to do that is if they're not familiar with the institution and they're skeptical. They're looking at kind of a challenging research project, and they're kind of skeptical that there is the infrastructure needed to get the project done, that you want to make sure you cover that really, really well. I know that some cancer researchers have gotten that review back as well, because they didn't bring out that we have a NCI designated community cancer center in Christiana Care and, the Moore's pediatric program and stuff. They didn't tell people that there is a clinical research program in cancer here in Dublin. Can I move on to the next section? Are we good?
Yep.
Okay, cool.
Sounds good.
Okay, so the next section is the Biosketch. Now, one of the issues with the Biosketch is that the Biosketch format for NIH just changed. And it changed for grants submitted in the current cycle, I believe. The new format is even less, in my mind as a grant reviewer, even less useful than the older one was, which was even less useful than the one from 10 years ago. That said, we have to follow it, and you need to use the current grant format as efficiently as possible. And one of the things that the new Biosketch format, a lot of people have said this, and it's probably somewhat true, it really does disadvantage new investigators, because there is a section where you have to sell what are your contributions to science, I believe it is. So now there's one section, let's see if I might not put it on here, but there's one section where it's your personal statement. That's basically laying out what your contribution, why you're qualified to do the project. It's also where you explain things like maternity leaves or parental leaves, anything that killed your productivity that was not to your benefit or that was not good, like a gap in your career. Then there's also the section where you have to talk about your contributions to science. This is the place where a lot of scientists are having a lot of trouble because as scientists, we didn't go into this field because we wanted to do marketing and business. We're not, as a personality very often, the type of people who want to oversell your accomplishments. And there's definitely a tendency that if you oversell your accomplishments, people don't believe you, and that there's this skepticism about it. However, the new Biosketch format really forces you to lay out your scientific accomplishments and that, really look at what have you added to the field and be able to write that out and really, really sell it. This is not a place to be modest. You really have to tell people what did you accomplish and why the world is a better place compared to if you never existed as a scientist. Okay? The one thing is that if you're applying for fellowships, the Biosketch format is different than if you're applying for research grants. I did not look to see how the K, is K considered a fellowship or is it considered a research grant for the Biosketch rules? I'm not sure, actually.
I think it's considered like any of the other.
Okay. So you had to do the new Biosketch format.
I actually didn't. I fit within the time frame right beforehand,
Okay.
so I didn't have to.
Okay.
I think it's a fully effective, and yeah, it's coming up. But we're
Okay. So basically, you're not submitting any more NIH grants unless you're doing the new Biosketch format.
So, sorry, did you use the new format or did you not use it?
Lee did not because she applied right under the deadline
Got
for
it.
the new format. So, and I actually have not written one of these either myself, but there are, let me see if I can minimize this and pull up the Biosketch format here. This is the new Biosketch format. Can you see what's on my screen? So the new Biosketch format has a personal statement and positions and honors. Those are very similar to the old Biosketch formats. And then this is the personal statements where you talk about issues that might have disrupted your career. The new section, which is really the thing that is causing a lot of people to be really kind of upset, is this contribution to science section. And it's where you briefly describe 5 of your most significant contributions to science. For each contribution, indicate historical background that frames the scientific problem, the central findings, the influence of your findings, and your impact. And you can reference up to 4 peer-reviewed publications or other non-public research documents. I've seen some of these written, and the examples they give tend to be people who are like in the National Academy of Sciences or things like I won a Nobel Prize. I have not seen an example effectively done as yet for new investigators. And it's definitely part of the scientific blogiverse really talking about how making people do this is going to make new investigators look extremely weak when they're actually very strong. Now, one thing that is going to be really, really important going forward is this last section in the directions. Provide a URL to a full list of your published work as found in a publicly available digital database, such as SciNav or My Bibliography. And I have had contact now with My Bibliography, and My Bibliography isn't necessarily the most user-friendly or fun tool to use. It's basically part of the NCBI universe. You can get to it through PubMed. It's basically logging into My NCBI is how you get to it. And basically, this is a place where you can take your publications in PubMed and you import them into a dedicated bibliography. It works to a certain extent. However, if you have collaborative research, it can misattribute grants and which grants the research was done on. Where I ran into a problem is it was a publication that was from my lab, but one of my collaborators, her progress report was due before mine. She imported it into her bibliography associated with her grant number, which basically blocked my ability to do anything with the citation. I couldn't even attribute it or connect it to one of my grants. And it took me 3 weeks to straighten it out, okay? So it's a case where, about the time you are informing your research office you're going to write the grant, particularly since this is new, you really should work on your Biosketch, and you particularly should make sure you have a completely up-to-date My Bibliography, that you can put that URL into your Biosketch and make sure that it looks like you would want it to look to your grant reviewers, because it may not be something all that straightforward or easy. And I will tell you as a grant reviewer, I'm not going to read most of the stuff on this new Biosketch personally as a personal grant reviewer. I'm going to go to the My Bibliography link. That's what I need to know. I don't care about all this crap people are writing. I mean, some people may read this stuff, but I personally will only be going to that My Bibliography link. And that's simply because I can look at someone's publication record and say what their productivity has been and whether I care about it or not. I am not going to be interested in having the investigator try to blow their own horn. That said, you have to follow how the Biosketch is set up. So in my opinion, having a really well done My Bibliography is going to be crucial here. And it might not be the most straightforward thing to set up for you, okay? I can't really say a whole lot more about the new Biosketch format. I've never written one myself, and I've never reviewed a grant with one since it's a new requirement. But just things that you kind of need to keep up. I would also put somewhere on your Biosketch explicitly what your total number of publications are. Even if it doesn't ask for it, which it really doesn't. This has been good advice for 20 years for NIH Biosketches, because fundamentally that just giving me 3 or 4 citations, that might have been the only citations you've ever published. But if you're a young investigator and you have 20 papers, tell them. I mean, if you're an old investigator like me and have 80, tell them. Don't let people just try to figure it out. Because especially as a new investigator, people aren't going to know you. And you're going to want to give and show your productivity maximally strong.
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
So I've been working on my new format Biosketch for my K award, and I saw something really interesting on the PDF that you had up earlier.
Uh-huh.
One of the things you had on there was to mention your startup.
Yes,
under current support. I've never seen that. I've never heard of that before.
Okay, so basically, I think it actually is buried in the instructions somewhere now that that you want to be able to that you can put such things in your current support. The reason that you put them in is that there can be questions about independence. So if you were basically hired, you're given a strong startup package, you have, you're given, a nice set of independent space, you can really distinguish yourself from another investigator who's essentially a glorified postdoc who's been given a research assistant professor position as a hunting license, where there is no institutional support. So it can really help. It can really sell that your application, that your institution has made a very strong commitment to your success on the application. There's a lot of different ways you can actually express your startup package, but the fact that you have one will definitely be stronger than if you're a fellow or somebody who's been said, oh, you can write a grant, but we're not going to give you any help to do so. You can also really, in your Biosketch, talk about any commitment you have for release time from clinical responsibilities. That's also going to be something that may help the grant reviewers know that your current institution really values you and is making significant investments in your success. There's, like I said, there's different ways to do it, but it's certainly something that that can be really helpful, and I can't imagine it ever hurting you.
Is this a new instruction or new suggestion?
This is something that I would have said to somebody, 20 years ago. I have a friend of mine. It's kind of a funny story that the first couple years I was on NIH study section, back in the early 2000s, there was a applicant to the study section I was on who was clearly given a hunting license and no resources, reading his application. And the study section came back and said that there were significant concerns because the institution, this was, I think, Harvard Med, had given this investigator no institutional resources. So it's unclear whether he'll actually have access to the space and regular equipment to get it. He took our reviews to his medical dean and said, look, they love my science, but they're not going to give me the grant because you haven't given me anything that would let me do the grant. And he was given institutional resources in cash as well as dedicated space in response to those grant reviews. And it's funny is that because the guy involved is now a good friend of mine, and he always assumes that I was part of that group because, well, I actually was, but just because he knew the name on the study section. And, occasionally he'll just, twig me about it, that, thanking me for being involved, even though I've never confirmed it to him. I was one of the people who wrote it. It's something that while technically reviewers are not supposed to use that as a criteria in the sense of the review process, I will tell you it is used as a criteria. And I've seen more than one grant really say, and it's clear that the institution has a strong commitment to this investigator's success. And they'll put that in the investigator section under the criteria score. So you might not necessarily give the dollar amount, but you can certainly, if you don't want to give the dollar amount, that's fine. But to even emphasize that you have a competitive startup package and just make it really, really clear that the institution is investing in you, I guess is a good way to put it.
Okay.
And I think it's actually buried in the new Biosketch directions. I thought I noticed it, but maybe I was just reading something else.
Okay. That's really helpful. I did not know we could do that.
Yeah, it's good.
I have clinic. Okay, no problem. So any other questions about Biosketch things for right now? Unfortunately, I can't really talk more stuff about it just because it's new, but you basically want to get a criteria score of 1 or 2 for Biosketch. I mean, some things you just can't do anything about. You have the publications you have. More publications is always good. Productivity is always good, and for that Biosketch score. I don't know if research administrators have any other comments about that.
No, I've been put in charge to help with the new process to go through there, and just tell them this is very helpful as well, that I will be taking some of this. And just going through it's going to be the publications of just going through and getting everyone interested in getting into that part. Once we get squared away, it'll be like the next thing. All right, that one's done.
Yeah, well, and the thing about Biosketches is it's always a pain to do the first one. This new Biosketch, the Biosketch format we've been using for the past 5 or 6 years is a pain because you can't just use the same Biosketch in different grants because you really have to customize that section A, which is your personal narrative or whatever it is, because you have to sell what you're doing in this particular project. But from that perspective, it can be good. So with that, I'm going to go on to budget and justification. And I'm going to say less about this simply because this is more Mark's deal, but just a couple things that you do need to make sure you're very careful about explicitly justifying your costs. This is what you need to do to just even get it out of your institution and get it submitted. But it's, really make sure that you write your grant with reasonable costs, not too high or not too low. Asking for too much is incredibly irritating. I just reviewed a grant application in January where they asked for $480,000 a year in direct costs and 6 postdoc lines. It's like, no, sorry, not reasonable.
So do the reviewers review the budget?
They do. So it's not a criteria score. So the grant is reviewed separate. So it's not part of the impact score that you receive.
Right.
However, that the reviewers are asked their opinion on the budget. Now, if you ask for something completely crazy, like $480,000 and 6 postdocs, and this was a God's gift investigator, but I don't care how God's gift you are, that's annoying. It just sort of puts that annoying mindset in your brain, and you just have to think about, human nature. I just was already annoyed when I went to read the research plan. So you don't want to start with your viewer as annoyed. The other thing is it's very important not to lowball your budget, because if you are saying you're going to do this extensive project for a budget that your reviewers are not going to think is reasonable, you're going to come across as naive. And that is going to shade your investigator criteria score, because you didn't ask for a realistic amount of money. So, you go and one of the probably most frustrating things is you ask for a reasonable amount of money, NIH is still going to cut it. I mean, I had a grant about 6 years ago where I got a 1.2 percentile on this grant. Okay, it was clearly the top grant in the study section in that cycle, and they cut me a year. So instead of 5 years, they gave me 4, even though all of the reviewers said time and amount. And then every single subsequent year, my budget was cut. So I had 250 in the first year, I got 245 in the second year, 240 in the third year, and 235 in the fourth year of that grant. Now it had gotten a 1.2 percentile, okay? Let alone grants that are closer to the funding pay lines. So, you just have to realize that, and there's certainly no percentage in lowballing, but also don't go crazy and go too high. So with that, I will pass it on to Mark, who can tell you about the nitty-gritty budget stuff from the budget people.
That's Melinda, yeah, very good back and forth with it. The one thing I would say is I can spend your money very quickly. It's just over the years, you just get to the point of certain things. And as Melinda was saying, that it's a modular budget, but at the same time, for most institutions, your business office or your administration office, they're going to need to know detail of how it's going to be. So as I can say, I could spend your money quickly is if you're on a K award, you're going to be a certain percentage. You're going to be a large percentage, actually, like 75% of your money or salary is going to be going towards that. Plus, you have benefits that goes with that. You're going to need, or you're going to have a postdoc. You're going to have a research assistant on there. Those things, right there, you're talking probably about $100,000 has already been spent. If you have animals on the project, with that part of it, the travel costs, the supply costs, publications, all those different things, we have experience of doing that, different numbers that we can at least give you a ballpark figure. And at the same time, we don't want to completely pad your budgets, as you're saying, that it's an obnoxious budget. But at the same time, NIH has put a freeze on salaries now that once you ask for a salary of, if you're making $120,000 and it's a detailed budget, however it is, it's now going to stay $120,000 for the rest of that life, unless something happens with the government. But I don't see that happening anytime soon. So we're trying to help pad the budgets in other ways, because if there is going to be cut and salaries are still going up, how can we take care of that? So we try and add at least a 3% into the cost for a modular, just to have those costs, but we don't want to be crazy about it, as you're saying.
And the thing is that they will, and the thing is that your total budget amount will drop for like I just got my non-competing increment. My grant was funded for 4 years at $250,000 a year. The non-competing increment I got 2 weeks ago was for $245,000. And I had published, I think, 6 papers last year. So it wasn't that they were dissing me because I wasn't productive. They were dissing me because they had no money, and they're taking $5,000 off of everybody's grant so they can fund one more R1. That's why it was done.
Also, detailed budgets are good for the administration, because at that point now we have, if this does get awarded, then we have a certain amount of percentage that we can basically set up in there that we know that person's funded in your lab and how much you're getting percentage as well. So we have that squared away. Again, that's something we can, I like to meet with the people right away when they say they're going to put in a project, and we can, from there, that's one of the first discussions we have is how much it is. Because if, say, you're applying for a K award, then with that, the indirect cost, no matter what is 8%. So you have to follow that 8% indirect cost rate. If there's something other different rates of different things, we can help you out with that process. So all those different things your administrator can help you out with. So I know a lot of people like to do things themselves, but that's one thing we can take off your plate, that we can easily help you out in that process.
So is everybody good with budgets?
I have a question. So last week I submitted an R03, and I snuck in this statement in the sample size calculations that the university is funding half of the costs of a particular procedure.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I'm able to enroll more subjects in the study than I would be able to just with the NIH funding. Mm-hmm. Is that a good thing or a bad thing from a reviewer's perspective?
I think it is. I think it is probably reasonably neutral. I think it's good from the reviewer's perspective if it takes you into the power you need to actually get good data.
Right.
NIH does not give any benefits to cost shares in the actual funded process. So it might make the reviewers happier because then you have much stronger power, but it's not going to affect, I think, the program officer in relationship whether they fund your grant versus someone else's.
Right. Okay. Thanks.
But it certainly didn't hurt. It certainly didn't hurt your case any.
Okay. Good. Thanks.
So any other questions about budget? Okay. So since we're getting a little bit short on time, why don't I combine the discussion of human subjects and animal subjects? I think that basically this is a case where it's the same things that I've talked about before. Absolutely don't leave them for the last minute, and absolutely make sure that these sections are appropriate for your project. I can personally speak to animal subjects sections more because that's what my research focuses on, but I have seen people have written an animal subjects section for one application, and clearly this was a last minute thing. It's like, crap, I didn't write the animal subject section, and they copied and pasted it from another application. The procedures being done are different. The mouse mutants being used are different. So basically the animal subject section didn't correspond with the rest of the application, which flags it and also can really delay funding if they get funded, because all of that has to be worked out. It's also, like for animal subjects, there's 5 different sections where you really have to explicitly address things. Don't just say there's going to be veterinary care. Give the name of the veterinarian. Give the where they got their degree. How long have they been doing animal stuff, and so forth and so on. That if your grant gets flagged for either a human subjects or an animal subjects problem, it isn't supposed to affect your impact score necessarily, but it certainly will. It puts you into a secondary review process at NIH. And I had a friend of mine, for instance, who got flagged in his animal subject section, and he almost didn't get his grant because they had a little bit of money left over. They were funding him at the end, and he couldn't get through this animal subjects review at the NIH in time. And it was a very near thing whether he almost didn't get his grant because of that flag. Now, animal subjects and human subjects are also under just-in-time information. In other words, you don't have to give IRB or IACUC approval unless they give you a notification of a possible award and the just-in-time link comes on. The problem is that it can take longer for you to actually get your IRB approval or your IACUC approval than the window for the just-in-time information to be sent in. So if you haven't started the process to get your IRB protocol or your IACUC protocol, you might not be able to provide the approval just in time enough to actually get your award. So generally, even if you don't have your IRB in place when you apply, it's a really good idea to file IRB paperwork right then. I realize that you might not want to do that if you might not get the grant, but the risk on the other end is that it'll take too long to get your IRB approval and you might not get your grant. So that's often a really important thing. Now, while I have never seen a mistake in an animal subjects section, really, except for primate work, annoy the reviewers enough to really affect the impact score. The human subject section can really make or break a grant. If you do not do this adequately, that if you don't really use the human subject session to really address the full challenges of patient numbers, power analysis, do you have the appropriate racial, age, and gender diversity in your study population? This is also the place where you need to explicitly explain why your study population might not be the full racial, sex, or age diversity. And it's a good idea if you're studying Alzheimer's to say, I'm not including children because children don't get Alzheimer's. I'm prostate cancer, I'm not including women because women don't get prostate cancer. I would urge you to be that explicit about your study populations because you never know what reviewer you're going to get, and you don't want this to be flagged at all. That also the human subject session, it's almost like an addendum to the research plan. It really is a place where you lay out your sample sizes, your power analysis, and all of these sorts of things. So use your humans, fill it out, follow the rules, but really use this as a way to sell that you have the resources necessary to really do that human subjects research. And just one other thing I'll add, and I'll let the research folks here talk about more, is that with human subjects research, I actually do a decent amount of it, but almost my research is always exempt because I use de-identified human samples. The thing is that the reviewers are often somewhat fuzzy on the rules of exemption. I think there's 6 categories of possible exemption, and the reviewers are often fuzzy on them. You don't want your grant to be flagged for human subjects issues because the reviewer is fuzzy about the rules. So if you're doing exempt human subjects research, you want to say, I'm doing this, I have these samples, I am doing this power analysis, and that it's exempt under this criteria for these reasons, and state it explicitly. This way, the reviewer unfamiliar won't flag your grant when it doesn't deserve to be. And I'll let people who are more familiar with human subject stuff talk from now.
No, I would agree with you. We just had an NIH R21 that it was a resubmission, and that was one of the critiques there was they didn't know if it was de-identified how was the information on it, and it was an exemption. So yeah, to answer that in the resubmission part of it, he had a nice score on it, but that was a knock to him that he had to take care of that part of it as well. With human subjects, yes, we'll work with you as far as bits and pieces. We could have some wordings, and each of your administration should have some kind of wording that we can at least give you, again, a guideline to go with, and then you can fill in from there of different forms where to fill out. The only other thing I would say is on the NIH grant, things have changed a little bit. It's tricky now that when you're doing for human subjects, you have protection of women and children, minorities. You have the human subject section, and it used to be in that same section was your sample size of how many people you're going to have. That is now moved. That's up on the top of the page of the 424 form. So your administrator has to click on that page to now open that up to get your sample size. To say you have 50 people that are white or African American, or have those numbers in place, so you have that. So.
Actually, one other thing that I forgot to mention, a new thing to NIH is the inclusion of gender diversity into studies. This is particularly a really big deal in animal studies because there's a lot of animal studies where males were used exclusively because they tend to have less intrinsic variability because there's no effect of the estrus cycle. It's also that there's an awful lot of human research that is done solely with males because of concern of reproductive issues with women, as well as things related to the intrinsic issues with the menstrual cycle. The new rules actually are specifically saying that you have to really address why you're not using animals or people of both genders. And just saying that females are more variable is not sufficient justification. You have to say for a scientific reason, it can't just be convenience either. So you really have to sell why you're not using female animals or people in your studies. And, it can be, don't hesitate if you're studying prostate cancer. Say that women don't get it, this is a big issue also with some drug trial studies in rodents, because these are traditionally all done with male animals, which is no longer considered appropriate. So any questions about human animal type stuff? There's just a couple other things I want to address real briefly. We good? Yeah, I guess we're good. Okay. So the last two sections that are little teeny sections, but they can cause you big trouble if you don't do them. The one is the resource and data sharing plans. That essentially there is now requirements that if you generate any sort of resources that could be important to the scientific community, you need to really disseminate that. Like these resources can include genetically modified animals, it can include DNA vectors, it can include antibodies and so forth. And that you need to explicitly say what your plans are to share those resources with the community. Now, I think most institutions now have a good boilerplate for this because they require the Uniform Material Transfer Agreement and these sorts of things. You can generally use their boilerplate. If it's animals, you need to talk about whether you're going to give them that, under what circumstances will you let the animals out, going to a qualified animal facility and things like that. That's really important. The other one is the big data sharing plans. Now, I personally have not had to submit that, but if anybody doing genomics work, anybody who's like doing either exome sequencing or full genome sequencing, large scale genetic studies on humans, you have to have a plan that the data you generate will be freely accessible to the scientific community so that others can use it. It's particularly valuable to people who do bioinformatics. And you need to really explain how you're going to deal and share that data freely and at what time in the process you're going to share that data. And the last one, which is kind of a pet peeve of mine, and I flag a lot of grants on this, and that's biosafety. A lot of investigators assume that biosafety just means you're working with a BSL-4 organism, like you're working with Ebola or something like that. But biosafety is actually an issue as soon as you hit BSL-2. And BSL-2 includes human clinical specimens because they always have the potential to be infected with human pathogens. It also includes retroviruses, lentiviruses, a whole host of things that, we have to have biosafety plans in place for, and that needs to be explicitly addressed. And particularly, things like if you're looking at human specimens in core facilities and things like that, you do need to bring out, just address that in a biosafety plan. It doesn't have to be real extensive, but you should say that you're aware there's biosafety issues and that you're prepared to deal with things correctly. And I think that's it from the standpoint of the base environment pages for your standard NIH proposal. Definitely anything that's like a K award or any kind of training award, that's another whole can of worms, which is kind of beyond the scope of what we're going to talk about today. I don't know if there's anything else that Mark has.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
So any other questions from people online?
Nope, this was really
Yeah,
helpful.
that's great. Thank you.
Okay, sounds good. And it's as usual, if there's any questions that come up as you think about this, feel free to shoot me an email, okay?
Thanks.
Okay. And
Great.
Eric,
Thank you so much.
okay, go. Nice talking.